families throughout the state of Florida and beyond in bringing premier speakers, authors, presenters, people within the autism community who can really bring some valuable information to all those families living out there. This was especially an effort to be able to support families that have a really hard time accessing services, getting out to conferences, and gaining the information that you need to help your lives become just a little bit easier as you move through your life. So today we have the honor and the privilege of having Dr. Barry Prizant with us. And he has a very lengthy bio, so I'm just going to read a few things for you guys. He is a speech pathologist with 45 years of experience in research in the field of autism. He's an adjunct professor at Brown University and the director of the Childhood Communication Services, which is a private practice working with people on the spectrum and beyond. Publications include the SCIRTS model, and I think a bunch of you are probably familiar with that. But it's a manual and an educational approach that's now implemented across a variety of countries around the globe. He's presented at more than 800 seminars and keynoted addresses internationally, including 2 invited presentations at the United Nations on World Autism Day. He is the author of Uniquely Human, which is something that we're going to be talking about today. And this book actually was ranked by Book Authority as the #1 of the 75 best autism books of all time. So thank you, Dr. Prizant, for coming on and speaking with us today.
Thank you, Stacy. It's my pleasure.
So I think that we have, finally, after many years, a new look at autism and how we all view autism. And I definitely think it's moving towards a more diverse and, a diverse world in general.
Mm-hmm.
And so not only with autism, but with whoever you are, which is a beautiful thing. And so I wanted to be able to talk a little bit about the gifts that we often find in autism and how parents can really help their children discover who they are so that they can be as successful as, as a parent, we hope any of our children are. We shouldn't put any limitations on our kids, no matter who they are.
Yes.
So I know when I started reading your book, you talk a little bit about dysregulation in a person with autism. Can you kind of speak to what that might look like and what those strugglers, like what could they be struggling with as far as how would we see a challenge, I guess, with dysregulated?
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to start when we talk about dysregulation, what being well-regulated emotionally is and what being well-regulated physiologically is. And I like to say that, and we say this in our educational model, the SCIRTS model, which is a collaborative model with a number of people from different disciplines, Amy Laurent, Emily Rubin. And we talk about when a person is well-regulated, they are most available for learning and engaging. So you all know what it feels like when you are well-regulated, when you've had a good night of sleep, when you're motivated to learn something, when you're with people whom you trust. If you're not well-regulated, we know that in life we all have challenges. And those challenges make us less available for learning and less available for interacting and engaging. And less available for tolerating a range of situations in our lives. So when we talk about dysregulation, we're talking about any human being can be mildly dysregulated, a little bit anxious, maybe you didn't sleep that well the night before, you really can't focus as well, a little bit concerned or worrying about something that's going to happen in your life, or maybe a change in routine. And we could be extremely dysregulated. And that is when you are no longer available for learning and engaging. And we talk about people who have meltdowns, tantrums, shutdown. So what does it look like? In terms of the behaviors that would tell us that a person is dysregulated or experiencing dysregulation, that varies greatly from one person to the next, as it does with all people. So an autistic child, for example, might be pacing back and forth or gaze averting, not looking at you, apparently not attending. The thing that's tricky there is very often people on the spectrum are attending, even though they don't give us those signals that they are. It could be a person holding their hands over their ears, vocalizing loudly to shut out too much sensory stimulation. And that's another important point. The causes of dysregulation in autism are varied. And we like to say, unfortunately, that people on the spectrum are much more vulnerable due to their neurology. They are much, much more vulnerable in experiencing varying degrees of dysregulation than we are. So, for example, if we go into a loud, noisy environment, we might tell ourselves, well, I only have to be here for 10 minutes and then I'm leaving. Or we might move away and go to a quiet corner. Or we might tell other people, please, it's too loud and noisy in here. Whereas an autistic child, an autistic adult who has sensory sensitivities might not be able to cope in that situation. They may run away, they may cover their hands with their ears and start vocalizing loudly. So the point is that dysregulation is what explains so many challenging and problem behaviors in autism. And therefore, we believe we have to go beyond just managing the behavior, as in a behavior management approach, such as ignoring a child who's vocalizing loudly or telling them quiet mouth, quiet mouth. We have to get at the source of the dysregulation. And we have to teach that person coping strategies, to tell us they need help, to tell us they need to go for a walk, they need a break. But the focus is on strategies to help them stay well regulated, which seem to come naturally to most of us who are so-called neurotypical. But strategies to stay well regulated physiologically and emotionally don't seem to come that naturally to people on the spectrum due to the fact that their neurology is different.
In your book, you talk about a boy named Jesse
Mm-hmm.
who had some fairly significant behaviors. And through your research, you discovered that he was scared, he was confused, basically just distraught. So I find that a lot of times we tend to look at a behavior and just go, just move instead of really closely examining the cause of the behavior and make some false assumptions that it's from one place or another. So, in that particular case, can you share with us a little bit about how you discovered that he was in fact confused and scared, um, and then how you kind of got the team to start looking at it to build his trust in them as the professionals who were helping him?
That's right. Yes. And that ties nicely to the first question. That when we looked at Jesse, and let's give Jesse's mom all the credit here, because Jesse was in a school district where they just looked at the behavior. They saw the behavior as non-compliant, as challenging, and they put rather punitive procedures in place, and they didn't know how to react to his dysregulation. And Jesse's non-speaking. Jesse has a seizure disorder. Jesse has very significant sensory sensitivities to sound, auditorily defensive, to touch, being tactily defensive. So his mother actually said, this isn't working in this school district. And she petitioned the school district to have him be served in a nearby school district that used a different approach. That approach happened to be the CERTS model. So what we did was we looked at the sources of dysregulation, and we saw he did not have an effective communication system. Because in the other district, it was believed that you have to control the behaviors first, then you introduce a communication system. They also tried to work on speech training, and he had a significant problem forming speech, known as a motor speech disorder. So we immediately gave him and began to teach him alternative modes of communication. At that time, it was picture systems. It was low tech. It was prior to iPads and Prolo Quotago. We also really tried to change environments and really help him understand his schedule throughout the day, which is very, very comforting, which supports a person's regulation. So the difference was that, first of all, mom recognized that what was happening was not working because he was in 4-point restraints 4 or 5 days a week. And because people were trying to control and manage his behavior rather than help him with his dysregulation. And then we look very carefully through the lens of our model, which is, what do we do in social communication, which is one of the best ways to support a well-regulated state, when a child could say, that's hard, or I don't want that. And they could say it non-verbally as well. So we wanted to give him a voice, and we wanted to also make sure his schedule and what we did during the school day supported a well-regulated state. And let me say, we wanted him to have fun in school. We wanted him to be able to associate school with what we call positive emotional memories. He knew I was going to school, I was going to see people who respected me, and I was going to do things that I liked. And this didn't turn around overnight. This was many, many months, but over many, many years, he became a success story in that school district because he was thought of as the worst behavior problem this other district had ever seen before.
Yeah, I think I don't know how much you know about Florida, but we've had some significant challenges in the last couple of years as far as safety in our schools, and I think that a lot of our schools are very scared. And as the fear in all the staff have built up, I think that children with autism have certainly, uh, received type of behavioral management, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
that have not been very favorable for a child with autism. So we are muddling through that, and hopefully we can get to better outcomes like the one that Jesse had. Um,
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to echolalia, you talk about that a little bit in your book, and I think a lot of parents are kind of scared of it because it is very, um, it's like it could be a hallmark of autism spectrum disorder,
Mm-hmm.
or as an indicator, an early indicator, especially. And so, when a parent of a child with autism, so I'm not really talking about adults, I'm talking about children. So, when you have a child with autism and you see the child engaging in a lot of echolalia, do you have like tips on what we should do? Should we ignore it? Should we try to modulate it a little bit? How do we respond to that?
Yes. And I want to be clear, what I'm saying right now is not just my opinion, it's my opinion, but it's also based upon years of research and published peer-reviewed research. And that is, it used to be thought that echolalia was nothing but a negative symptom of autism. And actually, the grandfather of applied behavior analysis, Ivar Lovaas, many years ago, he and his colleagues put forth procedures and studies to try to reduce echolalia, sometimes through punishment, sometimes through ignoring. And at the same time, I was doing my doctoral dissertation on echolalia, following 4 children over a year through videotape analysis. Now we're going back to ancient history. We're going back to the 1970s. And we found that echolalia served a number of functions and purposes and was actually a part of the children's language development. Okay. So if you want to put it this way, there's been a 180-degree shift. And even Dr. Lovaas, before he passed away a few years ago, changed his opinion totally and said that the appearance of echolalia is actually a positive indicator that there will be further growth in language and communication, not a negative autistic symptom. So when it comes to what do we do about it, first of all, we have to recognize that it's, in most cases, a child or a person's effort to maintain engagement in social interaction. In other words, they want to continue the interaction with you. But there's also forms of echolalia that are self-talk, where a child might be trying to calm himself. Don't worry, it's okay, everything's okay, where he or she is repeating something that had been said before. Okay, so there are many things we could do regarding echolalia. First of all, we can, if a child echoes long phrases, we could break them down. So if a child says to you, want to go outside and play ball? And they had memorized that whole chunk, because echolalia very often is memorized chunks of language. We could say, oh, go out, play ball. So we're showing our son or daughter, well, here are the words. I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're meaning. But here's another way to say it. We could also use visual supports. And we do this a lot. Now, a small percentage of echolalic kids are also what's called hyperlexic, which is a precocious self-taught reading ability. They're really drawn to the written word. They're motivated to read. So very often kids who are echolalic also benefit by having written scripts, almost like recipes to take you through activities, and visual support such as icons and pictures are often very, very helpful as well. So we have to first begin by understanding that for the great majority of echolalic individuals, echolalia is a positive signal that there will be further growth in language and communication. Also, that it serves different functions. So if a child says to you, want a cookie, that would be a request. Okay. If a child says to you, no more, because he had heard it before, that obviously is a protest. Okay. The tricky piece is sometimes scripting, or what we used to call delayed echolalia, repeating things that were heard previously, like from a video or a discussion that mom and dad had at home. sometimes it's not that easy to understand what the meaning is. So in the book, I give many examples of that. I talk about a young girl named Chloe. And I was consulting to her in a school, and I came into the classroom. She didn't know me. She turned to her teacher and said, "Got a splinter, got a splinter." And without missing a beat, her teacher said, "Chloe, it's okay. Dr. Barry is a nice man. He's a nice man. He's going to spend some time with us today." And she looked at me and went, "Got a splinter." And then she began to echo, "Dr. Barry's a nice man." And she calmed down. In that case, got a splinter meant I feel anxiety. I feel some degree of discomfort, even pain, because I don't know this person, and this person is coming into my classroom. Okay. Now you might say, how did that phrase "got a splinter" get attached to that meaning? And I asked the teacher, and the teacher said about a year before, she had been on the playground and she got a very bad splinter outside on the playground. And people said to her, "Chloe, you're okay. You just got a splinter. You got a splinter." And she associated "got a splinter" with the pain and the anxiety she was feeling and began to use that phrase. So echolalia is, from my perspective as a speech language pathologist, it's fascinating because it's almost like, and we've published a lot on this, an alternative way to acquire speech and language. Now, I will say that some kids, some people get kind of stuck at different stages of echolalia. We have a stage model of echolalia that spells out how kids move from echolalia to true creative spontaneous language. And some kids, it's much, much more difficult. And for those kids, they probably have much more severe language processing problems. And we definitely have to use augmentative alternative systems with those people.
And I think too, how smart are you to take words and associate them? I mean, just think of the level of intelligence that requires to be able to do that, because the rest of us just have the words. So we just spit the words out. But to have to really think about, the way that she felt a year ago or whenever, I mean, some of these kids I see, it could be a long time before that they had that experience that gave them that association, and they call upon those words that they are able to communicate in so many different instances. I think it's pretty amazing.
It is, and it's understandable because for years, going back to the 70s, research on autistic individuals has demonstrated that they tend to have strengths in memory, especially rote memory. And unfortunately, we know we tend to have, human beings in general, tend to have better memories for events that are stressful and difficult. But we also see people on the spectrum repeat things with great joy when they're very, very excited. So I just saw a YouTube video of a mom and her son. She's talking about her son. It had to do with problems in faith communities and taking her son to church, but how he had memorized so many important parts of the church service. And sometimes he would joyfully get up in anticipation of the minister about to say something and say what the minister was about to say, because it was part of the rituals of the church service. And she talks about how it's just the joy that you see in him when he knows that's going to be part of the service that he's seeing.
Yeah, well, of course, too, the comfort that they have and the consistency of knowing for sure what's going to happen next. I mean, I know for my son, he loves the pattern of being able to be in one of our church services, because he knows exactly sort of how things are going to kind of pan out. And it just makes him able to participate. So in your book, you also refer to obsessions as enthusiasms. So
Yeah.
I know that a lot of parents spend a lot of money sometimes, and a lot of time, energy, and teachers do this too, trying to kind of push out those things that the rest of us may see as an obsession. So can you talk about how maybe even for ourselves, how we can look at that in a more healthy way,
Yeah.
and also be able to help the person kind of find out who they are through looking at this a little bit more carefully?
Yeah, and I think this is a hallmark of the changes that have gone on in the history of autism. We have moved much more towards a strength-based model, which comes out of positive psychology approaches, if you will. So let me first begin by giving credit where credit is due. The term enthusiasm comes from a person, unfortunately, that many people in autism don't remember or never heard of, and that's Clara Claiborne Park. And that was a mom who was also an English professor, who wrote the very first book about raising a child with autism. It was called The Siege, and it came out in 1967. And I had Clara speak at a conference a few years ago, a fundraising conference for a parent retreat that we've been doing for 25 years. And the question was, her daughter, Jessie, became a very talented painter and still is. She's in her 50s now. And the question from the audience to Clara said, well, it's obvious that Jessie had many obsessions in her life. How did you deal with it? And Clara, who passed away about 10 years ago, was 78 at the time. And she said, in her kind of halting voice, she said, obsessions? Obsessions? We've always thought of them as enthusiasms. And she then went on to speak about how she and her husband always looked at what Jessie was riveted about, what really grabbed her attention, what did she get excited about, what did she talk about a lot. And yes, many people told her and her husband, you need to stop this. This, because if you think of the word obsession, it has more of a negative tone than a positive tone. So she said, we called them enthusiasms. Now, she said, and I say this in my book, Uniquely Human, that it doesn't mean it doesn't drive you crazy sometimes. It doesn't mean what a child is riveted on and wants to do over again and talk about all the time isn't interfering sometimes. But does that mean we just say stamp it out, extinguish it, stop it? The field has changed dramatically. And if you look at adults on the spectrum who are doing quite well in vocational settings, who become artists, who become involved in theater, something that I'm involved in, theater programs for people with autism, these were their quote unquote obsessions when they were young, and they were nurtured. And now we could look at them not only as enthusiasms, but we could look at them as passions, something they really want in their lives. Dr. Stephen Shore, a special education professor on the spectrum, who's a good friend of mine, he talks about these as passions. And anybody, any human being who is passionate about something will focus more, will do better, will work harder at it, will accept greater risks and challenges related to that passion because they know it lights their fire. And that's what we have to look at. So one of the big changes in the field of autism now is let's try to understand those enthusiasms. If they are interfering or get in the way, let's help the child or the person on the spectrum understand, well, there's a time and a place we could talk about that. There's a time and a place we could do that. But to extinguish it is to extinguish the humanity of the person, because it's what gives joy and focus to that person. We have to become more creative. And thankfully, so many people are becoming more creative now.
Yeah, no, that was really good. A lot of the kids in schools, I know in Florida we have a lot of code reds now, so which is like a lockdown, and kind of teaches the kid what to do if the school goes under a lockdown. And for many kids, the sound of the alarms is so fear provoking that they literally will go into echolalia in an attempt to reduce their anxiety from the minute they get into the building in the morning, anticipating that maybe today is another day to have an alarm. So can you, that's just a brief example of one I know that we're dealing with a lot here, but our kids could very easily have a tendency to fear things because they don't understand what if the fear is actually warranted or if it's not, especially if they struggle with receptive communication. And the people around them haven't spent enough time really giving them other ways to understand things. So can you kind of give us some ideas about if you're a parent of a child who has a lot of fears in things that maybe we don't understand, what the parental approach might be to kind of looking at that to help soothe their child's fears and anxieties?
Sure. And I'm going to be speaking in general terms because when it comes down to specific situations, specific supports might be necessary. But number one of the greatest stresses for all people, but especially for people on the spectrum, is uncertainty and unexpected events. So if things are happening, excuse me, that are a surprise. I mean, I always like to give the example of birthday parties, or Santa Claus coming into a room unexpectedly and in the holiday season. We think most kids love those types of things. But unfortunately, for many kids on the spectrum, it's a surprise, it's unexpected unless it's been practiced and the child has been, or the adult has been prepared for that. So we want to reduce uncertainty. So we want to give kids information. You're going to, there's a saying now in education, what helps autistic students and people on the spectrum is typically helpful for other students and all people. The thing is, we're not as vulnerable to those stresses as a child on the spectrum. So if it comes to fire drills, if it comes to lockdowns, we want to give information. We want to give accurate, direct information. We want to practice, which we do. Okay. I remember many years ago when I was in school, the fear was nuclear war. And we would have kind of drills where you had to get under your desk and cover your head. Now it's lockdowns. So we want to give information. We could write social stories about it. We could have visual sequences about it. We have to practice it. But at the same time, put, if you will, it's not so much of a positive bent, but that this is not just a terrible thing. We will be okay. I like to teach kids on the spectrum mantras. Everything will be okay if I do this. Oh, that will be okay. We can fix this if it's broken. So we want to reduce uncertainty, practice, give information on the sensory level. If there are alarms that go off, then what we want to do is offer supports that are helpful in so many cases, such as noise dampening headphones, or teach kids we could cover our ears if it's getting too noisy. Or is there a quieter place in the classroom or in the cafeteria that the child can go to? Now, I realize I'm going beyond lockdowns right now, just as I'm speaking about this, but it's about reducing uncertainty, putting the right supports in place, helping the student understand how those supports can be used, but at the same time emphasizing we will be safe, we will be okay, because security and trust in an environment and other people is really important. Unfortunately, a sudden lockdown drill is violating things that are predictable, it's unexpected, and on a sensory level, it's difficult. One other thing I like to emphasize, and that is it can be stressful for kids on the spectrum because the teacher might be teaching a math lesson, very joyfully so, and then there's a lockdown drill, and all of a sudden, the teacher changes totally and becomes very, very serious and goes through the steps for the lockdown drill. That could be very confusing to some autistic people, students on the spectrum, because they may have difficulty understanding the emotional expression of people anyway. So I would also include in that, depending upon the child's understanding and how to do it, that, if there's a lockdown, the teacher may stop the lesson and become very, very serious because we have to make sure we listen carefully and we follow our instructions. In other words, preparing them in so many different ways. And that's all we can do. But that actually is helpful for all kids, not just for our kids on the spectrum.
In your book, you spend a lot of time talking about how autism is part of who the person is. And I think a lot of parents really struggle with that, and they spend a lot of time trying to push out a lot of who they are, really. And so, what are some tips that you can offer for parents to just kind of start, even just a little bit, changing the way that they look at autism as just this separate kind of thing, and how it's just part of who their kid is, and that just by having autism doesn't mean that you have less abilities or potential for outcomes. I mean, I know some people with autism make a lot more money than I do.
Right. Yeah.
So how can we kind of help parents, especially the younger parents, who are still kind of really kind of edgy and figuring out their own way, into recognizing the abilities of their kids, and that the autism is kind of part and parcel of who they are?
Yes. I would say the easy, quick answer, number one, is listen to autistic people. Listen to them speak at conferences, read what they write on their blogs. I can say, literally, if you count my start in summer camps as a teenager, I've been involved in the field for half a century, more than 50 years. And I would say over the last 10 to 15 years, my involvement with the autistic community that is now referred to as the self-advocate community, and their organizations, such as the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, GRASP, out of New York City, which is actually international. I have learned so much from my friends and colleagues who are autistic, who are on the spectrum, because they have the first-person perspective. There are some books coming out right now. One just recently came out about uh, autistic people writing directly to parents and saying, this is what you need to know about autism. And I'm an autistic person telling you so you can understand your child better. So in my mind, that's very important. So for example, this is not just talking. We've been doing a parent retreat for 25 years. This will be our 25th year this coming fall. And we have autistic adults over the last number of years coming to our weekend retreat where there are 50 to 60 parents in this beautiful, relaxed country setting, so they can hang out with autistic adults and ask them questions and get advice from them and get to know them. I think that's important. I mentioned before we got started that I'm involved in 2 theater companies, and one of them was co-founded by autistic adults. It's called the Spectrum Theater Ensemble, and they're using theater to help educate the public about the experience of autism. There's so much information out there now that was not out there more than 10, 15, or 20 years ago. It used to be just Temple Grandin. And now there are thousands of autistic people speaking at conferences, writing books, writing blogs. And I know personally many parents who've had a major turnaround in their attitude about understanding their child once they got to know and really immerse themselves in this great body of information that autistic people are now sharing with us.
Well, they always say go to the source, right? Whenever you need the information. So,
and not only that, but they're fascinating and great people. I mean, there are certain things about autistic people, and I know you had mentioned your son, the honesty, the directness. There are some qualities of autistic people that we wish everybody had, because so much of the social fog that we deal with all the time in terms of, does the person really mean what they're saying to me now? Or, it looks like that person's trying to act like they're happy, but I know they're really angry at me right now. All of those things that create confusion for all of us socially are not there with many autistic people.
right.
And I'm not just talking about, we could easily say, oh, Barry, you're just talking about the very, very verbal, and I don't use this term, I'm just using it now, so-called high functioning autistic people. I find it to be the case even with autistic people with greater challenges, more limited communication skills, if we learn how to appreciate who they are. And through our parent retreat over 25 years, and parents change every year, but there are some parents who've come every year, almost every year. You could just see the attitudes change. It's not about fixing my child or changing everything about my child anymore. It's about understanding them and putting the right supports in place so they can grow and evolve as a person.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, the supports are huge. Sometimes when I see kids where we say that they're included, inclusion, but yet there's no support. And then we wonder why the student isn't doing so well. It doesn't take long to, tease that out.
Yeah.
I wanted to share with everybody. So the platform has changed. So let me see if this is. Yes. Okay. So there at the bottom of your screen is the link for this book. And I encourage everyone to go get it. It's an easy read, lots of great information, lots of examples of some of the stuff that you guys are dealing with every day. So I think it really can help some of you think about your own child and think about the kids that he mentions in the book that he's worked with in the past. And I think it'll be really valuable to you and kind of help you along your journey a little bit.
Great. And if I could mention one thing, a little bit of a plug here. In the book, there's a chapter where we talk about, and I give examples from our parent retreat weekend. And what we've just started to do is provide a one-day training prior to the retreat, and then people could stay the whole weekend through the retreat. And we give you all kinds of materials, and we do this hand in hand with a parent-run family support center. So it's parents. We co-teach this with parents who know the retreat. So if anybody's interested, you could email me, or you could go to Community Autism Resources Parent Retreat. And it's Columbus Day weekend coming up this fall. Very special for us, our 25th anniversary.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome. We need those everywhere.
Exactly. That's why I said that. Yeah.
Another job to add to your list. Go
Right.
around and replicate the program. All right, so
Absolutely.
Dr. Prizant, I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking to us and sharing your great wealth of information with all the families out there.
Stacey, it was my pleasure.
All right, and all of you guys, you have an amazing day, and join us again as we reach out to our communities.
Great.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.